The salty breeze swept Tatum's auburn hair across her face as she stepped out of her car, the familiar sound of seagulls squawking in the distance tugging at her heart. She paused at the top of the hill overlooking the coastline, taking in the vibrant blue expanse of the ocean stretching to meet the sky. Years had passed since she'd last stood here. The view hadn't changed, still stunning, still constant, but she had. The world had shaped her, molded her, and now it had brought her back home. The town below bustled with life, a mix of tourists and locals weaving through the streets as they visited shops, cafes, and coastal attractions. Among them stood the aquarium, its sleek, modern facade a stark contrast to the quaint charm of the rest of the town. It had always been one of her favorite places as a child, a haven where she'd spent countless afternoons marveling at the mysteries of the ocean. As she walked down the cobblestone path toward it, a wave of nostalgia washed over her. Memories of a little girl with wide eyes pressed to the glass came rushing back. The curious child who'd dreamed of working with animals, who'd imagined herself diving into the depths of the sea or trekking through jungles. Her lips curved into a smile. That little girl had grown up, chased her dreams, and now she was here, searching for something she couldn't quite name. The aquarium doors slid open with a quiet whoosh, and a rush of cool, filtered air greeted her. The familiar hum of water pumps and the distant laughter of children added to the ambiance. The entrance hall was bright and alive with energy, walls adorned with colorful murals of coral reefs, sea turtles, and schools of fish. She glanced at a directory and decided to wander through the main exhibits, letting her feet guide her. As she stepped into the dimly lit tunnel of the first exhibit, the world seemed to shift. The ceiling above her was a curved panel of glass, and beyond it, a shimmering world unfolded. Rays of sunlight danced through the water, illuminating the graceful movements of stingrays and small sharks gliding above. Tatum stopped, tilting her head back to take it all in. Her chest tightened, not with sadness but with something deeper. An ache, a longing she couldn't quite put into words. It was the same feeling she'd had as a child, watching these creatures move so effortlessly, so free. Only now, it was tinged with the awareness of everything she'd experienced since. Successes, heartbreaks, the people she'd met, and the places she'd left behind. She pressed her hand lightly to the glass pane beside her, as if touching the barrier between her and the water might bring her closer to understanding what she was missing. As she moved further into the aquarium, the exhibits grew busier, families and couples chattering around her. She smiled at a little boy tugging his father's hand toward the jellyfish tank and sidestepped a distracted couple taking a selfie. Finding a quieter corner, she sat down on a bench next to a seahorse display, her gaze fixed on the tiny, intricate creatures bobbing gently in the water. This place was the same, yet it wasn't. So much had changed in her since her last visit, but the aquarium, with its timeless beauty and calming presence, offered her a haven she didn't realize she'd been yearning for. The seahorses drifted lazily in their tank, their tiny tails curling around strands of seaweed like miniature anchors. Tatum leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging it slightly as she studied their delicate movements. She'd always loved how something so small could hold its own in the vastness of the ocean. She smiled to herself, lost in thought, when a sudden tug of excitement pulled her attention toward a group of children racing toward the next exhibit. Curiosity guiding her steps, she followed the group, winding through the aquarium's maze of tanks and displays until she reached a larger, more open area. The space was alive with energy, the ceiling soaring high above with massive panels of glass showcasing a swarm of silvery fish that moved as one. Tatum stopped in her tracks, craning her neck to watch their synchronized dance. For a moment, everything else melted away. She stepped forward, captivated by the scene, and instantly regretted it. Her foot landed squarely in a puddle of water, slick and cold, sending a small splash up her leg. Before she could process what was happening, her other foot slipped slightly and she barely caught herself against a nearby railing. "Whoa, careful there!" The voice came from behind her, warm, teasing, and threaded with just enough concern to make her cheeks flush in embarrassment. Turning, she found herself looking up into a pair of vivid green eyes that sparkled with amusement. The man standing before her was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the light blue polo shirt and name tag of an aquarium staff member. His hair, dark and slightly tousled, looked like he'd just stepped in from the beach. He was holding a towel in one hand and a small, bright orange traffic cone in the other. "Guess I should have gotten this out here sooner," he added, setting the cone down beside the puddle. It read, "Caution, wet floor" in blocky letters. "Are you all right?" Tatum straightened and glanced down at her soaked sneakers and damp jeans, the ends of which were now clinging uncomfortably to her shins. A laugh bubbled out of her before she could stop it, a mix of mortification and disbelief at her own clumsiness. "I'm fine, just my pride that's a little bruised." His grin widened. "Well, as long as you didn't sprain your sense of humor." He held out the towel, and she hesitated for a moment before taking it, dabbing at her sneakers in a futile attempt to dry them. "Thanks," she said, still laughing softly. "Guess I should have been paying more attention to where I was going. Or maybe I should have been faster with the cone," he replied, the corner of his mouth quirking into a playful smirk. "I'll take half the blame if it makes you feel better." She couldn't help but smile at that, the warmth of his charm cutting through her embarrassment. "It does, actually. Thanks for the assist. She glanced at his name tag, only to realize it didn't have a name on it, just the word guide in bold letters. Her brow furrowed slightly. "Do you have a name, or do I just call you Guide?" He chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "Let's go with Guide for now. Keeps things mysterious." "Mysterious?" she repeated, arching an eyebrow. "Or suspicious?" "Depends on your perspective," he shot back, his grin never faltering. "But how about this? I make it up to you. Let me give you a tour while your shoes dry. Promise I'll steer you clear of any more puddles." She hesitated, unsure why she was suddenly nervous. But the way he looked at her, like the suggestion was as natural as breathing, eased her doubts. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place it. "All right," she said finally, slinging the damp towel over her shoulder and crossing her arms. "Lead the way, Guide, but if I end up in another puddle, I'm suing." His laugh was rich and unguarded as he gestured toward the next exhibit. "Deal. Let's just hope the sea lions don't take offense to your shoes." As he guided her toward the next display, Tatum couldn't help but notice the ease with which he moved, the way he navigated the aquarium like he belonged there, and the way his voice, low and steady, seemed to blend with the rhythm of the place. The puddle she'd slipped in was already becoming a distant memory, replaced by the growing curiosity she felt toward this mysterious guide. "All right, so if you're going to trust me as your guide, there's one thing you should know," he said, walking a few steps ahead of her as they entered a quieter wing of the aquarium. His voice echoed slightly in the open space, bouncing off the curved walls of the exhibit. The air smelled faintly of salt water and something metallic, a scent Tatum had always associated with aquariums. "And what's that?" she asked, catching up to him. He pivoted to face her, walking backward with an easy confidence that made her envious. "I'm terrible at sticking to the script, so if you were hoping for a boring, fact-filled tour, well," he shrugged, the grin on his face tugging at something deep in her chest. Tatum smirked. "Boring wasn't exactly what I had in mind." "Good," he said, spinning back around to walk alongside her, "because I'm more of a show-don't-tell kind of guy." He stopped abruptly in front of a large cylindrical tank filled with swirling schools of fish, their silver sides catching the low light as they moved in perfect synchronization. "Take this, for example." He gestured to the display. "Most people look at these guys and think, 'Oh, fish, cool,' but they're missing the best part." Tatum folded her arms and tilted her head, studying the fish as they darted and weaved in hypnotic patterns. "Enlighten me, Guide." "They're called scads," he explained, leaning slightly closer to the tank. "Individually, they're fine. Not exactly the life of the party, but together, they're unstoppable. Ever seen a predator try to single one of them out?" She shook her head, intrigued despite herself. "They move like this," he continued, gesturing to the swirling mass of fish, "because it confuses predators, makes it harder to pick a target. It's the ultimate strength in numbers strategy." He shot her a sidelong glance. "I mean, if I were a fish, I'd want these guys on my team." Tatum laughed lightly, her gaze never leaving the tank. You've got a point. I guess there's something comforting about not being on your own. She hadn't meant to add that last part, but it slipped out before she could stop it. The guide turned toward her, his expression softening, as though he'd caught something in her tone. Yeah, he said after a moment, his voice quieter. There is. The weight of his words hung between them, and for a second she felt the strange, almost unnerving pull of familiarity again. She cleared her throat, breaking the spell. All right, what's next on this groundbreaking, unscripted tour? She asked, forcing a playful lilt into her voice. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. Follow me. They wandered further into the aquarium, the exhibits growing darker and more immersive. In front of a glowing jellyfish tank, he told her about bioluminescence with the kind of enthusiasm that made her wonder if he could have been a scientist in another life. At the sea turtle display, he launched into an animated story about a particularly mischievous turtle that had once outsmarted the aquarium's entire staff. You're making that up, she accused, laughing as they stood in the dim glow of the tank. I swear, it's true, he insisted, holding up his hands in mock surrender. That turtle had a vendetta against one of the interns. Every time she came near the tank, he'd... Spare me the details, she interrupted, grinning. I'd hate to lose faith in the noble sea turtle. He chuckled, and they moved on, eventually finding themselves in front of the main attraction, the massive ocean exhibit. The room was cavernous, dominated by an enormous wall of glass behind which sharks, rays, and schools of fish drifted lazily. The water had a deep, almost mesmerizing blue tint, and the light refracted through it in rippling patterns. Wow, Tatum breathed, stepping closer to the glass. No matter how many aquariums she'd visited, or how many creatures she'd worked with, this kind of display never failed to take her breath away. Yeah, he said softly, coming to stand beside her. His shoulder brushed hers, and she was acutely aware of how close he was. This one never gets old. For a while, neither of them spoke. The gentle hum of the water pumps filled the silence, along with the occasional gasps of awe from other visitors. It was the kind of quiet that didn't demand to be filled, and Tatum found herself relaxing into it, her earlier embarrassment forgotten. You know, he said finally, his voice low, when I was a kid, I used to come here all the time, sit right in front of this tank and watch for hours. I thought it was magic how the sharks could glide like that, how they seemed so unbothered by anything. Something about the way he spoke tugged at her memory, a faint, distant echo of a voice she couldn't quite place. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, studying his profile. What about you? He asked, turning the question back on her. What made you fall for animals? I mean, you're a vet, right? She nodded, surprised by the sudden shift in focus. I guess I've always felt connected to them, like they understood me in a way people didn't. She hesitated, then added, growing up, this aquarium was one of the few places I felt like I could really be myself. It's part of the reason I wanted to work with animals in the first place. Something flickered in his expression, recognition maybe, but before she could analyze it, he smiled. Guess this place has a way of leaving a mark, he said. Yeah, she agreed softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink around them. The distant noise of the aquarium faded, and she was struck by how easily he seemed to see her, not just as the accomplished adult she was now, but as the girl she'd once been. She quickly looked away, her cheeks warming. So, she said, forcing a lightness into her tone, are you always this chatty with visitors, or am I just lucky? He laughed, the sound breaking the tension. Only the ones who step in puddles. Tatum rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. As they moved on to the next exhibit, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. Something about the way he spoke, the way he carried himself. It was almost as if he knew her too. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The hum of the filtration systems filled the air as he leaned against the staff room wall, arms crossed, a faint crease etched between his brows. The aquarium felt different after hours, quieter, almost reverent, the soft glow of the tanks casting shifting patterns across the room. He usually found this time comforting, a chance to gather his thoughts without the buzz of visitors. But tonight his mind was anything but calm. He pulled his name tag from the pocket of his polo, turning it over in his hand. The bold letters spelling out guide stared back at him, a label that felt more like a disguise than a job title. He sighed and set it down on the counter beside a small stack of incident reports. Another leak in the sea lion enclosure, a malfunctioning feeder in the reef exhibit. It was a pattern he'd come to recognize too well. But the real problem wasn't in the tanks or the equipment. No, this went deeper. To something or someone intent on causing harm. His jaw tightened as he thought back to the first incident months ago. A subtle change in the water's chemical balance in one of the smaller tanks had almost gone unnoticed. Then came the broken pipes, the misplaced logs, the missing data from key research files. At first it seemed like coincidence, a string of bad luck, but it didn't take long for him to see the truth. Someone was sabotaging the aquarium. And if they succeeded, it wouldn't just be the staff or the visitors who paid the price. It would be the creatures that called this place home, the ones who couldn't defend themselves. He'd taken the job as a guide to blend in, to observe without drawing attention. It was a far cry from the conservation work he'd done overseas, the kind of work that had consumed his life for years. But this aquarium mattered to him, not just because of its mission, but because of what it represented. It was a sanctuary, a place where people could connect with something bigger than themselves. And he wasn't about to let anyone take that away. But then Tatum had walked in, and everything shifted. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by the thoughts tangling in his mind. Tatum. He could still see her standing in front of the jellyfish display, her auburn hair catching the soft glow of the tank, her laugh light and unguarded as they talked. She hadn't recognized him, and why would she? It had been years since they'd last seen each other, and even then, he wasn't the same boy she'd known. Time had changed them both. Still, seeing her again had stirred something in him, something he hadn't expected. She'd always had that spark, that fire, even as a kid. But now there was a depth to her, a quiet strength that both drew him in and made him hesitate. She was here for her own reasons, just as he was. And the last thing he needed was to pull her into the mess he was trying to unravel. He turned his gaze to the bulletin board on the wall, his eyes scanning the pinned notes and schedules without really seeing them. He'd told himself this mission didn't leave room for distractions, that he had to stay focused if he wanted to figure out who was behind the sabotage. But Tatum wasn't just a distraction. She was a reminder of everything he'd tried to leave behind, of the boy he used to be, the one who'd dreamed of staying in this town forever, of building a life that felt like home. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the secrets he carried pressing down on him. He couldn't tell her who he was, not yet. Not until he knew more. And even then, what could he say? That he'd stayed away all these years only to come back under an assumed name, chasing shadows? That he still remembered the way she used to laugh at his terrible jokes? The way she'd always been the one person who truly understood him? No, it was better this way. Safer. At least, that's what he told himself as he pushed off the wall and grabbed his name tag. Tomorrow, he'd keep playing his part, keep looking for answers. And if Tatum wanted to spend more time with her mysterious guide, well, he wasn't sure he'd have the strength to say no. The tour guide led Tatum into the next wing of the aquarium, his steps light and purposeful. The corridor curved gently, its walls illuminated by glowing blue light from dozens of tanks. Tiny fish darted in kaleidoscopic colors through coral displays, their flickering movements casting shimmering patterns across the floor. Tatum followed silently for a moment, struck again by the easy confidence in his gait, the way he seemed to belong here as much as the creatures in the tanks. "So," he said, slowing his stride to match hers, "did you always know you wanted to work with animals?" His voice was casual, but there was a genuine curiosity beneath it. "Pretty much," she replied, glancing at the tank beside her. A clownfish wove through the arms of an anemone, its orange and white body vivid against the pale lavender tendrils. "I don't think there was ever a time I didn't want to. I used to bring home every stray dog, injured bird, or wayward turtle I could find, drove my parents nuts." He chuckled, the sound warm and unguarded. "Let me guess, you were the kid with the shoebox full of worms or frogs under the bed?" "Bingo," she grinned at the memory, though the frogs didn't stay long. My mom wasn't exactly thrilled when one hopped into her laundry basket. I bet, he laughed again, shaking his head. I'm impressed she let you keep bringing animals home after that. Oh, she tried to stop me, Tatum said, her voice laced with amusement. But I was persistent. I think she eventually realized it was pointless to fight it. Sounds like you haven't changed much, he teased, glancing at her with a playful smirk. Not where it counts, she quipped back, her tone light but her words carrying an edge of truth. They stopped in front of a tank filled with moon jellies, their translucent bodies pulsing gently as they drifted through the water. The light in the room was dim, the jellyfish glowing faintly like tiny moons suspended in space. Tatum leaned closer to the glass, studying the creatures in awe. They're incredible, aren't they? The guide said softly, his voice almost reverent. She nodded. It's like they're not even part of this world. They've been around for millions of years, he said, stepping closer to the glass as well, long before us, and they'll probably still be here long after we're gone. Tatum glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly at the tone in his voice. There was something wistful about it, a hint of melancholy that tugged at her curiosity. You sound like you've spent a lot of time thinking about that. He shrugged, his gaze still fixed on the jellies. I guess I have. There's something humbling about it, you know? Knowing how small we are in the grand scheme of things. She studied him for a moment, taking in the way his expression softened as he spoke, the way the glow of the tank's light caught in his green eyes. That nagging sense of familiarity stirred in her again, but she pushed it aside. I get that, she said finally, her voice quieter. I think that's part of what drew me to animals in the first place. They don't overcomplicate things, they just are. They live in the moment. He turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You're right, he said. They don't waste time worrying about things they can't control. Maybe we could learn a thing or two from them. Maybe, she agreed, holding his gaze for a moment longer before looking back at the tank. They lingered there for a while, watching the jellyfish drift in silence. It wasn't an awkward silence, though. If anything, it felt natural, like they didn't need words to fill the space between them. Eventually, he broke the quiet. Come on, I've got something else to show you. He led her to another exhibit, this one dominated by a large, open tank filled with rays gliding gracefully just below the surface. The water shimmered in shades of turquoise and aqua, sunlight streaming through an overhead skylight. A pair of children squealed with delight as one of the rays skimmed the edge of the tank, its smooth, flat body breaking the surface for a brief moment. Tatum leaned against the railing, a smile tugging at her lips as she watched the rays move. There was something mesmerizing about their fluid, unhurried movements, the way they seemed to dance through the water without a care in the world. They're beautiful, she said softly. They are, he agreed, standing beside her. And deceptively smart. Did you know they have electroreceptors in their skin? They can sense the tiniest electrical signals in the water, like the heartbeat of a fish hiding in the sand. Impressive, she said, glancing at him with a smirk. Maybe you're not as bad at sticking to the script as you think. He laughed, his grin lighting up his face. What can I say? Some facts are just too good to pass up. She chuckled, shaking her head. Fair enough. They stood there for a while, exchanging bits of trivia and observations about the rays. Tatum found herself relaxing more and more, her earlier nervousness forgotten. There was an ease to their conversation, a natural rhythm that made her feel like she'd known him for longer than just a couple of hours. All right, he said eventually, pushing off the railing. There's one more spot I want to show you. He led her to a secluded corner of the aquarium, where a smaller tank housed a pair of sea otters. The playful creatures floated on their backs, their paws clutching bits of food as they twisted and turned in the water. Tatum's face lit up as she watched them, a delighted laugh escaping her lips. They're adorable. Yeah, he said, his voice softer now. They are. She glanced at him and caught the way he was looking at her, not at the otters, but at her, his expression unguarded and full of something she couldn't quite name. Her breath hitched, and for a moment she couldn't look away. But then he smiled, the moment breaking just enough for her to gather her thoughts. Thanks for the tour, guide, she said, her tone light but her smile genuine. I think you've officially redeemed yourself for the puddle incident, he grinned. Glad to hear it. Does that mean I've earned the right to keep my mysterious persona? We'll see, she teased, turning toward the exit. But you're off to a good start. As they walked away from the tank, she couldn't help but steal a glance at him, her curiosity growing with every passing moment. There was something about him, something more than just his charm or his knowledge of the aquarium. She didn't know what it was yet, but she was determined to find out. The two of them wandered into one of the quieter wings of the aquarium, where the lighting dimmed and the tank seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. Tatum trailed a few steps behind the guide, her gaze flicking between the vibrant displays and the man leading her through them. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something oddly familiar about him. It wasn't just the way he carried himself, though that was part of it. Something in the way his shoulders moved, relaxed yet purposeful, like he knew exactly where he was going and didn't need to rush to get there. It was more than that. It was in the cadence of his voice, the way he smiled at her, like he already understood her in ways most people didn't. She shook the thought away. She was probably imagining things. After all, they'd only met an hour ago. And yet, the longer they talked, the harder it became to ignore the nagging feeling that she should know him. This way, he said, turning back to glance at her. His green eyes caught the bluish glow of a passing tank, and for a moment she was struck by how vivid they were. She blinked, realizing she hadn't responded. Right, she said quickly, her voice a little tighter than she intended. She fell into step beside him, her sneakers finally dry but still squeaking faintly against the polished floors. They stopped in front of a sprawling reef display, the tank brimming with bright coral and darting fish. The guide leaned on the railing, gesturing toward the scene with a small smile. Fun fact, he said, his tone light. Most of the coral here isn't alive. It's synthetic, made to mimic the real thing. We couldn't use live coral, obviously, since it's so fragile, but we worked with marine biologists to make this as close to the real thing as possible. Tatum tilted her head, watching the colorful fish weave in and out of the coral branches. You sound pretty proud of it, she said, glancing at him. He smiled, a little softer this time, and his gaze flicked back to the tank. I guess I am. Places like this, they matter. They give people a chance to connect with the ocean in a way they might not otherwise get to. That's important. There it was again. Something in his voice, the way it dipped into something quieter, more thoughtful, that set her on edge in the strangest way. It wasn't a bad feeling, just unsettling, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. You really love this place, don't you? She asked, leaning on the railing beside him. He nodded. Yeah, I do. She studied his profile for a moment, her curiosity getting the better of her. Have you been working here long? Long enough, he said with a chuckle, his eyes glinting mischievously as he glanced at her. That's vague, she teased, narrowing her eyes at him. What's the matter, guide? Afraid I'll figure out your deep, dark secrets? He grinned, the expression as disarming as ever. Just trying to keep up the mystery. Isn't that part of the fun? Suspicious, she said, though her tone was playful. Still, the mystery around him was starting to feel less like a game and more like a puzzle she couldn't stop herself from wanting to solve. They moved on to the next exhibit, a towering cylindrical tank filled with tiny fish shimmering like flecks of gold dust as they darted through the water. Tatum tried to focus on the display, but her mind kept drifting to the man standing beside her. So, she said casually, if you've been working here long enough, then you must be from around here, right? He hesitated, a fraction of a second, but just long enough for her to notice. Something like that, he said, his voice a little too even. Her brow furrowed as she turned to look at him fully. You don't seem like the type to stick to something like that, answers. He laughed, deflecting with ease. You're pretty sharp, you know that? I try, she said, crossing her arms. But seriously, you seem familiar? Have we met before? This time his smile faltered just for a heartbeat. Maybe in another life, he said lightly, but there was something in his tone, something that didn't quite match the words. Tatum tilted her head, studying him with renewed intensity. You're not going to tell me, are you? What fun would that be? He countered, his grin flashing back into place. She rolled her eyes, but her curiosity only deepened. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something about him, something she wasn't sure she was ready to let go of just yet. Tatum stood at the edge of the massive ocean exhibit, the deep blue light washing over her like a wave. Sharks glided by serenely, their massive forms ghostly in the dim water, while tiny fish shimmered in fleeting flashes of silver. The hum of the filtration systems filled the cavernous room, but it barely registered. Her gaze wasn't focused on the spectacle in front of her. No, her attention was fixed on the man standing a few feet away. His back turned to her as he watched the creatures drift by. "Guide," she started, her voice hesitant. She wasn't even sure why she had followed him here after their tour had ended. Maybe it was the way he had looked at her earlier, like he knew her in ways no one else did. Or maybe it was that unshakable feeling that had been gnawing at her all day, a whisper in the back of her mind that she'd missed something important. Now, though, the whisper was louder, more insistent. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. The usual teasing glint in his green eyes was gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier. She took a shaky breath and stepped closer. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to be honest with me." The corner of his mouth twitched, but it wasn't the confident smile she'd grown used to over the past few hours. It was almost nervous. "All right," he said, his voice careful. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, searching his eyes. Do I know you?" His brows knit together, and for a moment he looked like he might try to laugh it off. But when she didn't back down, his jaw tightened. He turned his gaze back to the tank, the blue light reflecting off his face, casting it in sharp relief. "Tatum," he started, his voice low. Then he trailed off, running a hand through his hair. Her chest tightened at the sound of her name on his lips. It wasn't just the way he said it. It was the familiarity in his tone, like he'd said it 1,000 times before. It clicked then, like a lock tumbling open, and suddenly she couldn't believe she hadn't seen it earlier. Her breath hitched. "It's you, isn't it?" He didn't respond right away, but the way his shoulders tensed told her everything she needed to know. She took another step forward, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Luka," she whispered, the name feeling foreign and familiar all at once. Her childhood best friend, the boy she'd spent every summer with, the boy who'd known every secret she'd ever had, and the boy who had vanished from her life when they were barely out of high school. Finally, he turned to face her again, his expression a mix of guilt and relief. "You remember," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the water tanks. A wave of emotion surged through her, shock, anger, confusion, and something she couldn't quite name. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice rising. "All this time you've been here pretending to be someone else and you didn't say a word? Why? Why would you hide this from me?" He sighed, his shoulders sagging. "It wasn't that simple, Tatum." Her eyes flashed. "It wasn't that simple. You're standing here acting like a stranger, knowing full well who I am, and you didn't think I deserved to know? How is that not simple?" Luka, because she couldn't think of him as guide anymore, took a step closer, his hands raised like he was trying to calm her down. "I didn't plan for this to happen. Seeing you here today, it wasn't part of the plan." "Plan?" she snapped, crossing her arms. "What plan, Luka? What are you even doing here?" He hesitated, glancing at the tank as though it might offer him an escape. Then he sighed again, his shoulders slumping. "I'm working undercover," he admitted finally. "There have been incidents at the aquarium, sabotage. I've been trying to figure out who's behind it." Her brow furrowed, her anger momentarily tempered by confusion. "Sabotage? What kind of sabotage?" "Water contamination. Equipment failures, missing research data," he rattled off, his voice growing more serious. "It's deliberate, and it's escalating. If it keeps up, it could threaten the animals and the entire facility." For a moment, she was too stunned to respond. The gravity in his tone told her he wasn't making any of this up, but it didn't erase the sting of his deception. "You still could have told me," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "You didn't have to keep pretending to be someone you're not." "I didn't know how," he said, his voice raw. "Tatum, it's been years, and I didn't know how you'd react, or if you'd even want to see me again." Her throat tightened and she shook her head. You don't get to decide that for me. You don't get to just walk back into my life like this and expect me to be okay with everything. I know, he said, his green eyes pleading with hers. I know I messed up, but I didn't want to drag you into this. I thought it would be easier this way. She stared at him, her emotions a tangled knot. Part of her wanted to turn and walk away, to let the hurt and anger carry her out of this room and back to the safety of her own life. But another part of her, a part she couldn't quite ignore, wanted to stay, to hear him out, to understand. I don't even know what to say to you right now, she said finally, her voice cracking. Luka stepped closer, his expression earnest. You don't have to say anything. Just, please, let me make this right. Tatum looked away, her gaze falling on the sharks gliding past the glass. The ache in her chest was undeniable, but so was the pull of something else, something she hadn't felt in years. She exhaled slowly, her mind racing. I don't know if you can, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But as she turned back to him, the look in his eyes stopped her short. It wasn't just guilt or regret. It was something deeper, something she hadn't expected to see. Hope. And against her better judgment, she felt a flicker of it too. The late afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting long golden beams across the table where Tatum sat, her fingers curled tightly around a mug of tea she hadn't taken a sip from. Her mother bustled about at the stove, the rhythmic clatter of pots and pans filling the silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence, not the kind she'd grown up with in this house. This one was taut, stretched thin by words left unspoken. Finally, her mother let out a sharp breath and turned, wooden spoon in hand. I just don't understand it, Tatum, she said, her voice calm but laced with disapproval. You've worked so hard to get where you are. Why would you risk all of that by getting caught up with someone like Luka? Someone like Luka? Tatum's brow furrowed, her voice rising defensively. He's not some stranger off the street, Mom. You know that. I know, her mother said, softening slightly. And I know what he meant to you when you were kids. But that was a long time ago. People change. You don't know what his life has been like all these years, or what kind of trouble he might bring with him. Her father, sitting at the head of the table with his arms crossed, cleared his throat. Your mother's right. You've built a life for yourself, Tatum. A career you should be proud of. What happens if this rekindling throws you off track? Tatum's fingers tightened around the mug. You act like I'm about to toss everything aside for him when all I did was talk to him. She sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't even know he was here until yesterday. But now you do, her mother pressed, fixing her with a sharp look. And you can't pretend there isn't still something between you two. You always wore your heart on your sleeve when it came to him. That kind of distraction. She trailed off, shaking her head. It worries me. Tatum pushed back her chair and stood abruptly, the legs scraping against the floor. What worries me is how little credit you give me to make my own decisions. Her father raised a hand in a placating gesture. We're not trying to undermine you, sweetheart. We're just saying... No, she interrupted, her voice steady but trembling at the edges. You're saying you don't trust me, and that's not fair. She turned and made her way to the back door. He stepping out onto the porch where the salty breeze carried the familiar scent of the ocean. The knot in her chest tightened as she sank onto the porch steps, staring out at the horizon. Her parents' words echoed in her mind, each one striking a different chord of doubt. Were they right? Was she being reckless, letting Luka back into her life after all this time? She thought of his green eyes, the way they softened when he looked at her, and the hope she'd seen there. Was it really so wrong to want to believe in that? Her head dropped into her hands. For all her confidence, she didn't have the answers. Not about Luka, not about herself. All she knew was that she couldn't shake the way he made her feel, like a piece of her she'd thought was lost had suddenly come back. But whether that was a good thing or not, she still didn't know. The glow of the massive ocean exhibit bathed the room in a soft, shifting blue light as Tatum and Luka stood side by side, the silence between them heavy yet charged. The sharks drifted lazily in the water, their sleek, shadowy bodies gliding in and out of view. Tatum's arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed on the glass, though she wasn't really seeing the creatures beyond it. Her mind was still spinning, caught between the hurt of Luka's deception and the unease in his voice when he'd mentioned sabotage. Luka stood a few feet away, his head bowed slightly, hands shoved into his pockets. For a man who had spent most of their time together exuding charm and confidence, he now seemed uncertain, almost vulnerable. The sight twisted something in her chest, but she pushed the feeling aside. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "All right," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't try to soften it. "Start talking. What's going on here, Luka? And don't even try to deflect this time." He glanced at her, his green eyes shadowed, but he didn't flinch at her tone. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if resigning himself to the conversation he'd been avoiding. "You deserve to know," he said quietly. Tatum turned fully to face him, waiting. He hesitated, and for a moment, she thought he might try to find a way out of this. But then he took a deep breath and gestured to the tank behind them, the light catching the sharp angles of his face. "This place," he began, his voice low but steady, "is more than just an aquarium to me. It always has been. When I came back here, it was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to focus on something that really mattered. But then, things started happening." "What kind of things?" she asked, her arms still crossed. He paused, running a hand through his tousled hair. "At first, it was small stuff, a broken pipe here, a faulty pump there. None of it seemed out of the ordinary, just maintenance issues. But then it escalated. Tanks started leaking. The water in one of the exhibits showed signs of contamination. Some of the animals got sick, and no one could figure out why." Tatum's brow furrowed as she listened, the pieces beginning to form a troubling picture. "Contamination? You think someone's doing this on purpose?" "I know they are," Luka said, his voice tightening. "We started double-checking everything, water quality, equipment schedules, security footage, and every time something went wrong, there was a detail that didn't add up, a valve that had been tampered with, a file missing from the system. It's not random. Someone's targeting this place." Her stomach turned at the thought. She glanced back at the tank, watching the sharks glide effortlessly through the water. The idea that anyone would want to harm them, or any of the creatures here, was sickening. Why? What could they possibly gain from sabotaging the aquarium? "That's what I'm trying to figure out," he said, his jaw tightening. "At first, I thought it might be someone with a grudge against the staff, or maybe an activist who doesn't think aquariums should exist at all. But the more I dig, the less clear it gets. The only thing I know for sure is that whoever's behind this doesn't care about the animals or the people who work here." "And you're just doing this on your own?" she asked, disbelief creeping into her voice. "Why not go to the authorities, or at least let the management handle it?" "I tried," he said, his tone darkening. "But without proof, no one's taking it seriously. They think it's just bad luck or a string of coincidences. And after a while, I realized I couldn't just sit back and hope someone else would figure it out. So I took this job, blended in, and started watching, listening, trying to find out who's behind it." Tatum stared at him, her anger softening slightly as the weight of his words sank in. He wasn't just hiding for the sake of secrecy. He was trying to protect this place, to protect the animals. It didn't excuse the fact that he'd lied to her, but it made it harder to hold on to her anger. "You should have told me," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "I could have helped you." "I didn't want to drag you into this," he said, his eyes meeting hers with a raw honesty that made her heart twist. "You've got your own life, Tatum, your own work. I didn't think it was fair to burden you with this, or with me." Her throat tightened at the way he said it, with a mix of regret and vulnerability that made her chest ache. She looked away, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "You don't get to decide what's fair for me, Luka," she said softly. "You don't get to keep me in the dark just because you think it's easier that way." "I know," he said, his voice rough, "and I'm sorry. For all of it. For disappearing, for not telling you the truth. I didn't know how to face you after all these years. And then when I saw you here, I panicked. I thought maybe if I kept my distance, it'd be easier. But it's not." She looked back at him then, her gaze searching his. For the first time, she saw the boy she'd known so many years ago, the one who'd been her closest friend, her ally, her safe place. And despite everything, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him, the piece of her that wanted to believe in him. "All right," she said after a long pause. "If you're serious about stopping this, then I'm in, but no more secrets, Luka. If we're doing this, we're doing it together." He blinked, surprised, and then a slow, grateful smile spread across his face. "Together," he echoed, the word heavy with meaning. As they stood there in the glow of the tanks, the sharks circling behind them, Tatum felt the first flicker of trust begin to rebuild between them. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The vast, glowing expanse of the ocean exhibit stretched before them, its deep blue light casting rippling shadows across the floor. Sharks slid by in slow, lazy arcs, their silhouettes sharp and ghost-like, while schools of smaller fish darted in shimmering bursts of silver. It was quiet here, the kind of quiet that felt sacred, as though the aquarium itself was holding its breath. Tatum stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed on the enormous pane of glass. But her mind wasn't on the creatures moving behind it. She felt Luka watching her, standing just a few steps away, his presence as steady as it had been since they'd arrived here. This was where he had asked her to meet him, beneath the grand ocean exhibit, where the weight of their earlier conversations still lingered like a fog neither of them could quite shake. "I almost didn't come," she said finally, her voice soft but tinged with tension. She kept her eyes on the water as she spoke, watching the slow, unhurried movements of a stingray gliding by. "A part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear what you had to say." Luka shifted behind her, and though she couldn't see him, she could feel the careful way he was choosing his words. "I would have understood if you hadn't," he said quietly. "But I'm glad you did." Tatum turned then, her arms still crossed tightly against her chest, shielding herself from the vulnerability that threatened to surface. The light from the tank reflected in her eyes, making them shine like the water itself. "You said you wanted to talk," she said, her voice steady but firm. "So talk." Luka hesitated, his green eyes searching hers. He looked different now, less like the charming, quick-witted guide she'd met yesterday and more like the boy she used to know. There was a rawness to him, an openness that made her heart twist despite herself. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice low. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his nerves showing in the way his fingers lingered at the back of his neck. "I know I've already told you some of it, the sabotage, the reason I've been working here under a different name, but it's more than that. I've been carrying this for so long, Tatum, and seeing you again." He trailed off, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "It brought everything back." Tatum's brow furrowed, her grip on her arms tightening. "What do you mean, everything?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "You mean the years you disappeared without so much as a goodbye? The part where you left and never looked back?" He flinched, just slightly, but enough for her to catch it. "I didn't want to leave," he said, his voice rough. "You have to believe that. When my dad got sick, everything changed. My family needed me, and I didn't know how to handle it. I thought disappearing would be easier for everyone, for you." Tatum's lips pressed into a thin line, her emotions swirling like a storm just below the surface. "You didn't even give me a chance, Luka," she said, her voice trembling. "You didn't let me decide what I could handle. You just left." "I know," he said, his voice breaking slightly. He took a step closer, his hands hanging at his sides like he wasn't sure what to do with them. "And I regret it every day. You were my best friend, Tatum. You were everything. But back then, I was scared. Scared of what it would mean to stay, scared of what it would mean if I dragged you into all of it." Her breath hitched, and she looked away, her gaze falling to the floor. The tile glowed faintly with the light from the tank, soft and unsteady. "You don't get to decide what's best for me," she said quietly. "Not then, and not now." "I know," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was hurt you. And I'm sorry, Tatum. I'm so sorry." The rawness in his voice cut through her defenses, and she looked up at him again, seeing the pain etched into his expression. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the aquarium's pumps and the distant murmur of visitors in another wing. "I don't know if sorry is enough," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know if I can just forget all of it, what it felt like to lose you, to think I'd never see you again." Luka nodded, his jaw tightening. "I don't expect you to," he said. "I don't expect anything, Tatum. I needed you to know the truth, about why I left, about why I'm here now, and I need you to know that I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a second." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. The weight of his words settled heavily in the space between them, mingling with the ache she'd carried all these years. She wanted to hold on to her anger, to use it as a shield against the vulnerability that threatened to overwhelm her. But the look in his eyes, the quiet, unguarded sincerity of his apology, made it harder than she'd expected. "I don't know what this means," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can trust you, but I want to. I want to believe you." Luka stepped closer, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I'll do whatever it takes to earn that, Tatum," he said softly. "I'll prove it to you. Just give me a chance." She searched his face, her emotions a tangled mess of hope and doubt, anger and longing. And then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But no more lies, no more running." "Never again," he promised. As they stood there beneath the glow of the ocean exhibit, the water rippling in endless patterns behind them, the distance between them didn't feel quite so insurmountable. For the first time in years, it felt like there might be a way forward, uncertain, yes, but possible. And for now, that was enough. The ocean exhibit glowed softly around them, the movement of the water casting shifting blue patterns on the floor. It felt calming, almost meditative, but Tatum's heart was racing. She stood beside Luka, her arms resting at her sides, her fingers brushing against the cool railing. He was close enough that she could feel the faint warmth of him, even with the tension still lingering between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sharks drifted lazily behind the glass, unconcerned by the weight of the conversation that hung in the air. Tatum tilted her head back to watch a ray glide along the tank wall, its wings rippling like silk through the water. The silence felt fragile, like it might shatter if they weren't careful. "I've spent my whole life fighting," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "Fighting for my career, for what I thought mattered, for some idea of success that I'm not even sure I really wanted. And now," she trailed off, glancing over at Luka. "Now I'm standing here, wondering why none of it feels as important as this. As us." Luka turned to her, and the look in his eyes made her throat tighten. There was a softness there, a vulnerability that she wasn't sure she'd ever seen before. "Tatum," he began gently, his voice almost a whisper. "You don't have to fight for me. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to prove anything." She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "It's not about proving anything. It's about choosing. About letting myself want this, even if it scares me, even if it's messy." She paused, her fingers tightening on the railing, "Even if it means disappointing people." His brow furrowed slightly, and he stepped closer, his expression earnest. "I know your family doesn't think I belong in your life," he said, "and I get it. I haven't exactly made the best case for myself. But Tatum, if I've learned anything these past few years, it's that other people's opinions don't define us. What matters is what we want, what we're willing to fight for." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw the boy he used to be, the one who had shared every dream and every secret with her. But she also saw the man he'd become, scarred by time and loss, but still standing, still trying, still him. "And what do you want?" she asked softly, searching his face. "I want you," he said simply, his voice steady and sure. "I want us. I don't care how complicated it gets, or how many people tell us it's a bad idea. You're worth all of it, Tatum. Every risk, every challenge. I'm not afraid of that." Her breath hitched, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She'd always been the one to keep moving forward, to chase the next thing, never stopping long enough to let herself feel rooted anywhere. But now, standing here with him, she felt something she hadn't in years. Stillness. And it wasn't terrifying, like she thought it might be. It was steady, safe. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, and felt him squeeze back without hesitation. "Okay," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "We'll face it together. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." A slow, relieved smile spread across his face, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Together," he echoed, his voice like a promise. As they stood there, hand in hand beneath the glow of the exhibit, the water rippling behind them, Tatum felt something she hadn't in a long time. A quiet, unshakable certainty. No matter what came next, no matter how messy or difficult it might be, they would face it. Together. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The rhythmic sound of waves crashing filled the quiet as Tatum and Luka stood on the boardwalk overlooking the ocean. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, painted in soft hues of lavender and gold as the sun began its descent. A gentle breeze tugged at Tatum's hair, and she tucked a strand behind her ear, her eyes fixed on the shimmering water. Luka leaned against the railing beside her, his hands resting on the worn wood, his gaze steady on her. The weight of the past few days was still there, lingering in the space between them, but it no longer felt insurmountable. Instead, it felt like something they could carry, together. "I've spent so much of my life running," Luka said, his voice soft but sure. "Running from mistakes, from people who mattered, from everything I thought I couldn't fix. But I'm done running, Tatum. I want to stay. I want us to stay." She turned to him, her chest tightening at the raw honesty in his words. For so long, she'd felt like she had to face everything alone, her career, her family's expectations, her fears of disappointment. But now, looking at Luka, she saw the promise of something different. Something steady. "I'm tired of running, too," she admitted, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know what the future looks like, Luka, but I know I want it with you." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers as the corners of his mouth lifted into a small, heartfelt smile. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Whatever comes next, whatever waves hit us, we'll face them, together." Her eyes softened, and she nodded. "Together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, their silhouettes stood against the glowing sky, bound by a love stronger than the tides.